Got it. Um, so thank you so much for joining us. What a beautiful thing it is that you are here with us today, returning or maybe even for the first time. I'm really excited about the space that we're creating and your presence in it. My name is Oriana Ides, and I am a TA specialist at the Pacific Southwest MHTTC based here in Oakland, California. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Before we dive into the content of today, we want to take a moment to allow you to introduce yourself. So find the chat box and share who you are, the work it is that you do with young people and supporting mental health, and where you're joining us from. We'd love to see that, and also take a second to scroll up and down and see who we're in here building community with. So find the chat and introduce yourselves. I'm going to go over a few logistics today before we get started with the content. And so as you're introducing yourselves in the chat, I'm just go over a few things. If you are not speaking, we invite you to turn your mic on mute and your video off if you're moving. That just helps us center, and it supports audio quality. So that's important to note. Closed captionings are available at the bottom of the screen. We will be sending out resources that are shared here in the chat. So we invite you to share resources if you have any that connects to the theme of the day or that's supporting you in the work that you're doing. We'd love to elevate those. We've made every attempt to make sure that today's presentation is secure. If we need to end for any unforeseen reason, we'll follow up with the email that you used to register. So look out for that. If you're having any audio or technical difficulties, please private chat our tech support, and they'll be able to guide you through solutioning. Also, we will be dropping the link to a brief survey that we would really love you to fill out at the end of the session. And so heads up, keep an eye out for that. And please follow us on social media. I'm going to share a little bit about MHTTC. Please invite you to visit our website. We are 13 different centers across the country, all providing really powerful, meaningful opportunities to engage, to solution find, to skill build, and to network. And so we're including 10 regional centers, National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and then the Network Coordinating Office. In August of 2018, each MHTTC center received supplemental funding to address the needs for further implementation of mental health services in the school system. And so that is what is bringing this offering to you here today. I would like to share this disclaimer before we dive into content. I would like to remind you that the views, opinions, content expressed in this presentation don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, SAMHSA. So that is our disclaimer. All right, as I said, we're in session 6 of 7. So we are nearing the end of this community of practice that I must say has been incredibly profound, eye-opening, and like soothing balm in many regards for me to be a part of. Our goal has been to build a network of support among school communities that strengthen our individual and collective capacity to lead in challenging racial violence. And while forging cultures and climates of healing and wellness. So today we are here with a phenomenal educator scholar that is going to be sharing his work regarding coping to hoping, from coping to hoping, moving us out of a space of crisis into visioning and believing and forging something different. like to remind us of an effort to use person-centered language. And as we're engaging in community, as we're listening to the content of today's presentation, really hoping that we can center in strength-based and hopeful dialogue, inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, and perspectives and experiences. That we are healing centered and trauma informed, and that we understand the distinction between those two, both being incredibly important, that we're inviting individuals to participate in their own journey and to root into their own experience, that we practice non-judgmental listening and sharing, and we avoid assumptions, and that we're respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions and policies. So those are our values as a national center, and we'd like to offer them as ways of engaging today. So before we hand this over, I want to share just a little bit about our phenomenal guest faculty today, Patrick Kamanyang. He's an associate professor at the Teacher Education Department at the San Francisco University of San Francisco. He has been an English teacher since 1999, beginning in Los Angeles Unified School District, where he was awarded the most inspirational teacher by his students and others. So Professor Kamanyang currently volunteers also in Oakland Unified School District. He's collaborated with many groups and is at the forefront of really necessary healing work in education. I'm gonna hand it over to you, Cam. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Oriana. And thank you so much for inviting me. You know, I've had the honor of working with you for over a decade now, and I have always had a deep, deep respect for your commitment to community and, you know, anti-oppressive work. So, you know, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you all for being here. I don't know, am I supposed to talk about the overview? Yeah, just real quick overview. You know, I'll be talking a little bit about my research, you know, this construct of social trauma, a thriving narrative, and in the end, the importance of wounded healing, and to sort of ground us in the workshop today and our presence here. I'd like to begin with a quote from Audre Lorde. That was from a July 26, from a 1982 Audre Lorde speech titled "Learning from the 60s" at a celebration for Malcolm X at Harvard University. In it, she says that if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive, right? And so I just want us to think about the ways in which we have internalized the perspectives, perhaps possibly internalized the perspectives and narratives of others, perhaps intersecting systems of oppression, what impact that had on us as people and as a community. And the ways in which we've also captured our voice, understood the world from our own points of view, and what that has helped us do to reimagine ourselves, the world, and our place and destiny in it. And so to ground ourselves in some breath, perhaps we could think about this, just this concept of the quote. If you didn't define yourself for yourself, then you might be crunched into other people's fantasies for you and eaten alive. So what are some ways you perhaps were possibly crunched into other people's fantasies for you, and how did that compromise your health and well-being? And more importantly, what are the ways in which, what are the ways in which you learn to see the world from your own points of view, and how did that serve your interests? And so let's take 3 breaths. One to represent the past. How has this quote, or the idea in the quote, present for you in your past self, right? We'll take a second breath to reflect on the ways in which this may be present for you, or the ways in which you have disrupted this idea in your present life. And then as important is the last breath will be us reimagining our lives beyond this quote in the future. I hope that made sense. On the count of 3, deep breath in, deep breath out, reflecting on this quote as it relates to our past. 1, 2, 3. Breath in, hold, breathe out through your mouth. Let's reflect on what this quote might mean for you in the present. 1, 2, 3. Deep breath in through your nose. Hold. Deep breath out. And finally, how do you radically imagine your life in the future, beyond and disrupting the ideas in this quote? 1, 2, 3. Deep breath in through your nose. Hold. Deep breath out through your mouth. Thank you. Okay. It's my turn now, right? All right. So the session we have here today is based on research I've done for the last probably 13 years, 12 years, since 2008, when I took a position as a teacher educator at the University of San Francisco. I was working closely with Jeff Duncan Andrade and Sean Ginwright, where we were looking to the health sciences to inform our research in urban education, myself as a teacher. And so, I saw a lot of you in the chat name your work in, mental health services. So in many ways, as a teacher educator, as a teacher, I explored, and, some who are strict with training might even say trespassed into the health sciences. But in many ways, this is sort of like, Steph Curry learning ballet to strengthen his footwork and be a more effective basketball player. He might not be a ballerina, but his footwork had benefited a lot from learning ballet. And so my teaching and my teaching of teachers has also benefited a lot by my exploration and study of health science research. And so the pre-colon title is From Coping to Hoping. And so it's really the extended kind of title would be From Coping, Not Coping, or Maladaptively Coping with the social stressors in one's life to hoping, or what Leonard Syme, the epidemiologist from Cal Berkeley, says is a sense of control over your life, right? So from going from coping, not coping, or maladaptively coping to developing a sense of control over your life. And so the after colon title is for me a reminder on how best to approach that is by teaching students to thrive through social trauma. And I'll explore these concepts as I move forward. And so just a little bit of background. So I was, as already said, I was a classroom teacher at Crenshaw High School, South Central Los Angeles. And, I won an award, citywide award for most inspirational teacher. And I took that and I did my research on what is the transformative impact of teaching young people to read their world and the word. And so I drew from frameworks in critical pedagogy, Dead Prez, Let's Get Free, Lauryn Hill's Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, Erica Badu, Baduism, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Sandy Grande's Red Pedagogy. So sort of like really critically conscious, ethnic perspectives on critical pedagogy, and informed by critical social theory from Gloria Anzaldúa, Patricia Collins, Haunani K. Trask. And I sort of use that as theoretical framework for teaching young people to name their world in order to change it. And I took the job at the University of San Francisco, and I was teaching teachers how to, develop critical pedagogies informed by critical social theory. And they would come back and say things like, well, I did this critical pedagogical lesson, but quote unquote, students did not care about their learning. And so I knew that I was somehow missing the mark, that this approach to effectively serving the educational needs of students of color in Bay Area schools was somehow missing the mark. And so this is when we started turning to the health science research, epidemiology, social work, psychology, counseling, psych, neurobiology, so on and so forth. And what I concluded was, if we can't connect what we teach, whether it's gender studies, ethnic studies, critical pedagogy, if we cannot connect that to the social and emotional health and well-being of young people, then teachers would continually miss the mark. And as I started looking at a lot of the health science research, what I began to also conclude was that while critical pedagogy and culturally relevant teaching could learn from health science research, at the same time, health science research needed to learn from critical social theory. Because without a critical understanding of social context, that we are working with the social and emotional health and well-being of people, then we will be applying ahistoric and hegemonic approaches to health and well-being. And too often, ahistoric, hegemonic approach to wellness simply teaches people, multiply marginalized, historically oppressed people, to maladjust or maladapt to intersecting systems of oppression. And so the sweet spot, right, especially given all the intersecting systems of oppression or structural harm, what Paul Farmer, medical researcher, calls systemic violence, right? Whether that's rape culture, heteronormativity, state-sanctioned violence in all its forms, patriarchy, etc. And so the sweet spot for me then is the relationship between critical pedagogy, critical social theory, and health science research, which for me means that the most effective way to teach young people to go from coping to hoping is to teach them to thrive through social trauma, right? And so a little bit about what I sort of mean by social trauma. If there's a sort of spectrum, let's just say, of stress, psychological trauma, toxic stress, social trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD, and more, then we know that there's sort of varying degrees to which people respond to stress or stressors or traumatic stressors even. And so we know on one end of the spectrum you just have stress, and it's not always bad. Sometimes there's good stress, right? It sometimes adds strain, pressure, anxiety, increases anxiety, but it could lead to motivation, energy, alertness, so on and so forth. Then you have psychological trauma, which is overwhelming stress. Sometimes it happens because there's exposure to serious harm, major loss, divorce, death, leads to intense fear, sometimes a sense of helplessness, extreme confusion. And then you have toxic stress, which is prolonged, frequent, and strong. I'm hearing a strange noise. It disrupts brain development, leads to stress-related diseases, and compromises our quality of life. And where I sort of turn my attention to is social trauma, right? It's sort of understanding of trauma from, in its proper social context, right? And so you think about the Holocaust and survivors of the Holocaust. You think about the genocide of indigenous people, North Atlantic slave trade. You think about dispossession of Mexicans in what was originally Mexico and California, Oregon, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. It's a collective experience. It's historical, and it impacts people intergenerationally, even leads to the process of altered DNA and epigenetics. Then you have PTSD, which many of you are familiar with, and then you have sort of like recurring complex PTSDs, right? And so my focus is on social traumas, but I believe that it has implications for serving the needs of other traumas as well. And so you'll hear me talk about social trauma, much like gender-based trauma, what some people refer to as systemic trauma, gender-based, all types of, even Racing Aces, which came out of the Rise Center, to talk about race-based adverse childhood experiences. So when I think about thriving, it's really through the work of Sean Ginwright, who wrote a book called Black Youth Rising. In it, he cites the work of positive psychologist Virginia O'Leary. And so for me, when Virginia O'Leary says when a person experiences a trauma, or in my case, social trauma, there's 4 levels of functioning. The first level of functioning is submission. Sort of when you shut the blinds, you don't answer your phone, you don't return text messages, you're not looking at emails, you're sort of disengaging with the world. And then there's survival, where you are waking up begrudgingly, preparing yourself slowly, walking out the door reluctantly, making your way to work or school, slowly, and you show up, you're physically present, but you're mentally absent, and you're just, in the words of MC philosopher Talib Kweli, just trying to get by. And then you have recovery. Recovery is when you're finally functioning at the level you were functioning at prior to experiencing a social trauma. And one kind of popular way to think about this is perhaps the functioning substance abuse user who can wake up, get ready for work, leave, eagerly show up to work or school, do a wonderful job. They go home after and have their first, let's just say, alcoholic beverage, second alcoholic beverage. And by their third, they're sort of taking out their unresolved historical grief or past pain on the people most immediate to them, right? And this sort of increases throughout the evening until they, pass out or go to sleep and, sort of wake up the next day and go through the same thing. They're functioning at the level they were functioning at prior to experiencing this trauma or social trauma. But what we want to teach young people to do, what I say from a critical pedagogical K-12 perspective, is we want to teach young people to thrive through social trauma. And so, metaphorically, that means sort of learning how to become, a bigger person, right? And so this person, rather than, teaching in ways that help students simply matriculate through the highest levels of American schooling so that they are better positioned to access social mobility, perhaps get a good job, buy a nice car, move from the hood, and find happiness by escape. It teaches young people to turn their attention to the conditions that we would like to see transformed. And so this person will find purpose, right? So what part of the learning outcomes of this is teaching young people to find purpose as a result of properly making meaning of past pain. Thriving is also helping young people make sense of their struggle, right? Find strength as a result of making sense of their struggle. Thriving is also creating the conditions where, people or learners or students in this case will learn to join others in transforming the social conditions that led to their social trauma to begin with. And so that's trauma. The most effective way to teach young people to go from coping not coping or maladaptively coping, to hoping or developing a sense of control over their life, is to teach them to thrive through social trauma, not simply submit, not simply survive, not simply recover, but to thrive. And so, one of many ways I've heard, as a teacher educator, teaching teachers how to teach their students how to do this, we first have to teach teachers how to reflect on this in their own life. And I hear all types of stories all the time about the altruistic nature of, educational service providers. And, a recurring narrative is how so many of the women identifying teachers, or, teachers describe female identities at birth, talk about their experiences as survivors, and working with other survivors being a little too close to home. They found a space to thrive in education, specifically serving the educational needs of students who have historically been alienated from the type of quality education that could lead to post-secondary opportunities. And so providing quality education for those students fulfills the altruistic nature of many of these survivors on their own terms. And so their thriving comes from helping other people thrive against intersecting systems of oppression. And one way I try to teach people, or teach students, or even teach teachers to do this, is through the changing of and perhaps controlling of narratives. And this sort of requires that we design assessments that will develop and evaluate young people, right? And I think counselors and therapists also can, also develop assessments that develop and evaluate clients on the social compassion, critical analysis, and leadership qualities that are needed to transform unjust and disrupt dehumanizing social conditions. And so when you change a narrative, I think it's important that Judith Herman, a full professor at Harvard, who was a clinical psychiatrist in trauma and recovery, the introduction, wrote that it's totally natural for people to not want to revisit psychological traumas because it brings up painful experiences. It's totally natural to want to avoid the revisiting of painful experiences. And then Victor Carrion, pediatrician at Stanford, has found that empirically, when trauma goes unaddressed, it thrives in avoidance. And so for teachers, what that means is that there is no neutral ground. That we are either helping young people radically heal from and thrive through the social trauma they have to navigate that would destabilize so many of the adults teaching them. We are either helping young people do that, or we are compounding past pain and historical unresolved grief that children are too oftentimes coming into our classroom with. And so, the right side of the brain is where, and I'm pulling this work right here from Daniel Siegel, who is a child, a neurobiologist and child doctor at UCLA, who co-wrote a book called Healing Trauma. And in his chapter, and in his research overall, he talks about narrative. And he even found empirically that mothers who had the weakest bonds with their babies had what he referred to as incoherent narratives. And mothers who had the strongest bonds with their babies had what he referred to as coherent narratives. So if you take that sort of health science research and you combine it with critical theory, then we know that incoherent narratives are very much like dominant master majoritarian narratives, right? The narratives told about oppressed people by intersecting systems of oppression to maintain the interest of oppression, right? And so then coherent narratives from a critical point of view could be thought of as counter storytelling, counter narratives, or understanding the world from, a multiply marginalized point of view in the voice, image, and interest of historically oppressed people. And so the right side of the brain is thought to be this place where is the subjective, emotional, and visceral side of the brain. The right side of the brain, or the left side of the brain is thought to be the logical, objective, and rational side of the brain. But when we re-experience and experience trauma in the right side of the brain, the left side of the brain is where we construct narrative. So the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain is separated by the corpus callosum. And so in order to cross, and so people are constantly re-experiencing traumatic experiences when they are preventing that trauma from being processed, from allowing that information, the information from traumatic experience to pass through the corpus callosum, the billion bundles of nerves of that part of the brain, up to the right side of the brain, to the left side of the brain, where we construct narrative. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. And that's what's happening with constant re-experiencing of trauma, because that information is not crossing over so that they can create a story about their trauma. And that's why storytelling and narrative therapy research is so important in trauma work. Because once people are able to rationalize what happened in their lives, that it will help the healing process. But sometimes people can't handle the construction of narrative itself. It's still so overwhelming, so that there are many cases when it's not appropriate, because you have to re-experience intolerable past pain in order to integrate it. And so the re-experiencing is difficult to overcome for some people, while for others, it's extremely successful to construct narratives. And so for us, and what I teach teachers is it's important to not open wounds that we are not qualified to help heal, right? And so we have to guide students to professionals like you all who can help with that. Though culturally competent mental health services are still very few and far between. And so what doesn't get talked about is the long-term, intergenerational, historic, cultural, systemic-based traumas, right? That lead to this constant negative self-imaging and self-concept. And so we know that, some people say that when people will play an instrument, that they're tapping into the right side of the brain. And when they're doing sort of math and science, they're tapping into the left side of the brain. But research has since proven that oftentimes people are lateralizing cognition. And that's pretty much what a lot of this construction of narrative is about. When it comes to trauma work, it's lateralizing traumas. It's not like the trauma goes away. The trauma, much like a scar, is forever there, but the pain threshold or ability to manage that grief or anxiety or stress or depression or whatever improves over time. And so a lot of times when people have incoherent, or they internalize incoherent, dominant, master, majoritarian narratives, they have a sort of what I guess Carol Dweck would refer to as a fixed mindset. But when you are able to have a logical, rational, objective understanding of visceral, emotional, subjective pain, you don't simply internalize and reproduce majoritarian, incoherent narratives. Instead, you're able to rewrite the ending. And the important part about rewriting the ending, right, is I guess that's when you have a critically conscious growth mindset. When you rewrite the ending, you can live your life according to the new script that you've created for yourself. Revisiting past pain, constructing a narrative to make proper sense of that trauma helps externalize people's trauma and connect it to the larger historical and social context that our experiences that led to trauma took place in. And so similar to how, mindfulness work and meditation, oftentimes people will say, sort of pay attention to those thoughts that you have in your head and just sort of watch them go by. And sometimes people say journal. And because when you journal, it sort of objectifies subjective thoughts. What by distancing it and putting it on paper or on the screen, it helps you distance that experience from your, emotional experience. That's what creating narrative does with trauma. And so that leads to people developing hope, what Leonard Syme calls a sense of control over your life. But if you put that in conversation with critical social theory, it leads to critical hope, right? What Jeff Duncan Andrade calls critical hope, which is a collective sense of control over our lives to disrupt dehumanizing and transform socially oppressive social conditions. And so there's sort of many ways that I've done this as a teacher, right? I've done it through poetry, playwriting, students writing philosophies for self and social change. I have students do all types of literary as well as ethnographic research of the most pressing issues in their communities. Students are constantly taught to read the word and the world and using their life, their lived experience as primary text, right? So across my teaching, students are constantly studying their community cultural wealth. They're doing critical self and social reflection, and they're positioned as experts of their own wisdom to share their insights with each other to learn from collectively, right? Assessing students beyond what I think of their work as an individual teacher. We always create a collective container for that intra-generational wisdom. And so one of the most popular ways I've done that is through the reading of, and sharing of autoethnographies. Now, autoethnography is different than autobiography. Auto is self, bio is life, graphy. So autobiography is writing about your own individual life. How are you unique? It's sort of fragmenting in that sense. But autoethnography, auto is self, ethno is culture, graphy is writing. So it's writing about yourself as a member of a larger social group. And so students are asked, the reading, whatever it could be, the autobiography of Assata Shakur and so many others, right? Learning how to write narrative and to do narrative analysis, to do narrative writing, and to do narrative performance, right? And so you have students write 6 to 8 page APA styled narrative essays and present 10 to 12 minute narrative performances. And they essentially answer this question: who are you? What do you stand for? What experiences have you had that shaped who you are today? What does this mean for your community, and where do we go from here? And so they use readings that I assign them to do a theoretical, interpretive, and applicable analysis. Theoretical is, based on readings. What concepts in the readings help you remake sense of your life? Interpretive is, how is that relevant to you and how does that make you feel? And applicable is, now what? After you've done the first 4 levels of analysis, now what should you do about it? And so the example that I'll be showing you here today is of a student who is in the class. In this class I teach in Los Angeles every summer for 11th graders, right? 16-year-olds throughout Los Angeles, Watts, Compton, South Central LA, Altadena, and similar economically targeted Black communities. And so the following clip is from a student who is biracial, Black and Filipina. And you'll see her critically analyze her father and community's lack of mental health support, the impact that had on her sense of self, and the impact that had on her relationship to people that she should have been most connected with. And the title is Loving My Curls. Here is a 16-year-old student from South Central Los Angeles.
Outside the home, there's a lot of toxic masculinity because he obviously couldn't show his weakness. He never displayed his emotions. He always bottled them up. So all that hurt and sadness was expressed and conveyed through frustration and aggression. So everyone knew my dad as someone who was lovable and charming, but if you said the wrong thing or like you happened to step on his toes, he was quick to react. And that's just a result of how his mental health and how his feelings were addressed as a child. Even in his own household, there was a lot of anti-Blackness because he has 4 older siblings that are all mixed with Filipino, and he's the only one that's like full Black. So he always felt out of place and alienated. He never had that love and support that he needed as a Black like young man, to where he wanted to like excel and do well in life. He only thing he knew was football, and that was his only like escape, because that was the outlet he had to express his emotions. And this quote says, if trauma is collectively experienced, this means that we also have to consider the environmental context that caused the harm in the first place, meaning that my father mentally became a product of the environment. Mentally and emotionally, he didn't have the resources or the therapy or the coping mechanisms he needed to thrive instead of just simply living. And that was definitely passed down onto his kids. Like generational trauma is a real thing. I associated my Blackness, my own Blackness, with my father's weakness. Like this Black man that I had idolized for a long time was ready to give up. So why would I want to be Black? Because I associated him with my own Blackness. Like he made me and he can't even deal with it. Why should I? And on top of that, I was met with a lot of anti-Blackness in my own household, like wearing certain things was too grown or too fast, or slicking my hair or wearing braids was ghetto or ratchet. And like certain things just made me feel out of place. And especially in school, like I've heard multiple times, like I can choose when to be Black. I can turn my, like I have a Black card, they used to tell me. And so of course that feeling, that rejection, I didn't want to be Black. I festered on my own like feeling of anti-Blackness. Like I did not want to be in that community.
Okay. And so in this next clip, you'll see what the student says about how the literature, the critical theory, the ethnography assignment, and the humanizing classroom space, how those help her develop a knowledge of self, knowledge and love of self, solidarity with other Black people, and to define her identity in the interest of the community she now sees as more, her being more connected to as a result of the readings, the assignment, and the classroom space. And you'll also hear 2 students offer their affirmation for what she shared in her presentation.
All of those things I experienced do make me who I am, but they're not definitive of me. Like they don't define me. And I can obviously overcome that. Like we're all resilient in our own ways. And I thank all of you, everyone in this Zoom call, so much, because you guys have shown me my own strength and my own power as a Black young woman. And I remember Dr. Cam saying in the beginning, like, you need to listen, you need to understand other people and where they come from in order to be understood. So I took that meaning, like, and I like connected that with my father. And I need to understand where he was coming from in order to understand my own feelings and to be able to present the person that I want to be and do the things that I want to do. And yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate this space that you created, all the support that you like given everyone. I finally have the resources to address how I'm feeling, and the words and the vernacular and the culture to support that and my Blackness. Like, yes, I am mixed, but that doesn't mean I'm less Black. Like, in the end, I learned to love my curls. Like, and before I used to hate them. I straightened my hair all the time. I know I wasn't Black. I'm mixed. But now I wear my Blackness, like that's my pride. Like I love my curls. I love my ethnic backgrounds. I love both my father and both my mother equally because they are the people that shaped me. Their experiences shaped me and helped me see what was wrong with the world, but also what was beautiful and what was hidden. And yeah, any questions? These are my weak references and yeah.
Yeah, give it up.
In some ways I did relate to your presentation, like sometimes feeling that I'm not Black enough, or that that if certain people so oppress me, then why should I care about my Black heritage? So I think you're just really inspirational. And if you need anybody to talk to, I'm here for you.
Beautiful.
I can also relate to it in the sense that, especially during schools, how like if your grades fall a little bit, like it's like you assume right away, like, oh, it's just the course is too hard, or like, because like I'm not doing enough. But in reality, it's just like, to me, sometimes it's the system is against us. And it's just like sometimes our own lack of motivation to do well in an environment that doesn't want us to succeed and have these detrimental effects on our grades, for example. So I really connected to that.
And so there's a lot of deficit thinking, of like 16-year-old ability to engage in critically rigorous learning that I felt like her example helped disrupt the sort of deficit thinking of. But I'm going to end by essentially citing the work of Native American scholar at the University of Michigan in the Native American Studies and Psychology Department, Joseph Gahn, who wrote about the mental health profession, the culturally responsive mental health profession, that we need a great deal more of the kinds of professional mental health services that do not yet exist. And as a teacher and as a teacher educator, I apply that to say that we need a great deal more of the kinds of pedagogies that do not yet exist. And for the sake of time, I will go ahead and stop there. Thank you. Let me know if I just keep going into the dilemma thing. Yep.
According to our agenda, we have 2 minutes. If people want to, pose a question or share in the chat what's, resonating for them. There was so much power in what you and even your young people shared. And so, yes. We have this room for one comment if someone wants to, share what's resonating, what they wonder. And there's definitely space in the chat as well. We have about 2 minutes before Cam takes us into case study.
Can I share something real quick?
Yeah.
I love the video and I love the autoethnography. So I teach at a non-traditional school, and part of our, I'll put curriculum in quotes, is that students write an autobiography. That's like a graduation requirement. But every teacher does it differently. It's not, and it kind of connects to the last thing that you were just saying, is that we really need these curriculum. And I feel like in my school, like I love what you said, because it's such a missed opportunity. We're doing this. And if it was just structured better with this kind of like informed by everything that you just went through, it could be so much more powerful rather than just this like, writing exercise. And it's, kids everywhere should be doing it. So definitely appreciate this.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Justin.
There was a question that came in the chat to me around, like, what are some concrete steps that educators, school mental health therapists can engage in to get here and to manifest these new things, to think up these new new ways.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, in terms of the work with Eduardo Duran, who wrote Healing the Soul Wound, he pulled from the work of Carl Jung to talk about this concept of wounded healer. And the basic argument is that you have to first learn to heal from the different, psychological wounds, or, whatever, socially psychological wounds that you experience, because without doing so, that you will be engaging in the process of transference and then projecting onto your clients or your students the process you went through to, avoid trauma, or to avoid stress, or to avoid, whatever. And so by doing that, by like dealing with trauma or stress through avoidance, we will be projecting onto our clients or our students learned helplessness. And so I think concretely, we need to learn how to unlearn the internalized intersecting systems of oppression that we have too oftentimes internalized and reproduced in our life, whether it's homophobia, ableism, patriarchy, misogyny. We got to really learn to unlearn that privilege, depending on who you are, and then go through that painful process of critical self-reflection, so that we can use those reflections to teach students how to do that for themselves in their own lives, so that our personal growth will be reflected in our professional methodology. I think we need to learn from the intergenerational wisdom of the elders of the multiply marginalized communities that our students are part of, right? How can we tap into the intergenerational brilliance of the communities that we're part of? Last thing is, how do we share parts of ourselves, right, in ways that are comfortable, so that we're sort of modeling for people what health looks like in our lives. And that sort of shared vulnerability can perhaps be the model, or the mirror for young people to challenge themselves to sort of share their authentic selves in spaces that have historically silenced it. I mean, I could probably say a bunch more, but I would stick with those two. Start with yourself and model for others the type of humanity you would like to see in the world, or in your classroom, or in your space.
There's an ask for how to get a hold of you, Cam, but maybe we can move into the rounds of case study that you have planned for us.
Sure.
Drop your contact in the chat.
Cool. All right. The way I sort of made sense about this case study is through the work of Christina Villarreal. She's the director of teacher education at Harvard, who did her dissertation at Columbia Teachers College. And what she found was that the most effective teachers in New York had what she identified as an origin story. Right? So she said, across these 8 teachers, the one thing that stood out to me the most about them is that they had a strong sense of self, strong origin story. This led to developing a higher quality pedagogy, which obviously then led to humanizing learning experiences. And so let's go to the next slide. All right. And so let's use that RISE sort of framework to think about the answer to this third question, right? I don't know, what do they call it? Anyway, so story, right? And then Mario Martinez, right, neurobiologist Mario Martinez, wrote a book called The Mind-Body Code. And he says that, empirically speaking, research, that there are 3 archetypal wounds that people throughout the world experience: shame, abandonment, and betrayal. Everybody experiences shame, abandonment, and betrayal. What he doesn't talk about is sort of the sort of assets that people either have or need to balance out their archetypal wounds, which I would guess is pride, loyalty, and protection. So with that in mind, here, let me share my screen. Sort of with that in mind, we're gonna use yourselves and your life and your lived experience and your narrative as a case study. And so you will be in 3 different dyads answering a different question. In the first dyad, you're going to answer the question to describe it. There shouldn't be a question mark. It should be to describe a time when you felt the most culturally or personally betrayed, shamed, or abandoned, or on the positive side, loyalty, pride, and protection in the schooling system. If for whatever reason you choose to opt out from this exercise, just maybe reflect on the presentation with your partner or talk about something important to you. The second question will be, for the second dyad, how did this experience affect you as a person and as a pupil? So you'll probably need to summarize your answer to question 1 in like 5 to 10 seconds, and then answer, how did that experience affect you as a person and as a pupil? And then lastly, if you were your own educator, right? You know, and if you're thinking about that, that RISE thing, right? Whether you're a service provider, you know, whether it's internally, whether it's taking place in the community, whether it's systems and institution based, or, you know, it's thinking about history. How would, if you were your own educator, how would you have more effectively addressed your needs as a student at the time this experience impacted you as a person and as a pupil? And so let me put these questions in the chat, but let's just start with the first question. And maybe we can have the person who graduated high school more recently go first. Each dyad will have about, should we go 3 minutes or 4 minutes, Ori? 3. We're going to go 3 minutes. So you have to be mindful. At about the 60 to 90 second mark, you need to stop and then let the second person answer. So at this point, we'll have the first set of dyads. Person who graduated from high school most recently will go first, and you'll be describing a time you felt personally or culturally betrayed, shamed, abandoned, or loyalty, pride, and protection in the schooling system. And we will see you in about 3 or so minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope logistically it didn't work out ideally, as ideal as we hoped for, but hopefully that you still were able to have a good dialogue. We wanted to increase your contact with others, but hopefully going deep with one person was as meaningful as, you know, going less deep with more people. Could we hear from you all just some of your initial sort of thoughts and feelings? You know, what is coming up for you, you know, in your body or your heart, your mind, after having participated in that exercise?
I will try to, this is Karen, encapsulate a little bit about our wonderful group 1, that we were all incredibly human and present. So I think the folks who were there, who shared so kindly in this short period of time, that kind of a question I think we all had, and I don't have an answer for this, so I'm going to throw it out, is that when it comes to, you know, I was very gifted with the teachers in my life, period, you know, and some of them were still there after decades, which is on. And that was similar with another of my teammates on our conversation. But when it comes to looking, we didn't go negative. And I'm choosing not to go negative right now because frankly, I can't deal with this time change. So that's enough negative right now. So I'm pushing that aside. But when it comes to looking at a group that you're in culturally, that I wasn't really brought up totally aware of that 100%, because there was no discord. You see what I mean? There wasn't any confrontation. Maybe that was being hidden from me from my parents or whatever. And I went to Jewish middle class suburbia for school, right? So it's like and I also Washington, D.C. So there's some complexities that I haven't unpacked at all that I still need to process through. So I appreciate, Patrick, what you just shared, because I don't have an answer. I don't have a good answer. And I think a couple of us were kind of struggling, if I can say this, jump in team, how to really look at that and how to unpack that. And so if I'm not aware of the impact teachers played, let's say in a negative manner, how can I use what I'm learning and not be jaded by what I'm learning to say, oh, well, everybody's this way or that way? Because I don't really want to think that way, because again, that feeds into me being negative, at least from my perspective. I want to be aware, but I also, we were talking about intent. What is someone's intention? Are they intentionally doing harm? And if they are doing harm, then how can I let them know, you're doing harm? But realize that may just mean they need someone to have a conversation with them about that. And no one's ever taken the time. And that's kind of digressing from our conversation. So I'm very confused, which I think is an okay place to be. And Kim and Cecilia, you can jump in and say, hey, are you, whatever you want to add to the conversation, but need more time to go for a walk to think about this. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Did you say Kim or Cam?
We had Karen and Kim and
Cecilia. Okay.
We were a mighty triad.
That's a good place to go with that short amount of time. To at least you're reflecting versus rejecting. Others?
I'll go. My name is Angela, and I was with Michelle. We were in room 4. And so I'm going to try not to talk too much, because this was a very good therapeutic breakout this week, I think. I appreciate Michelle being vulnerable and sharing her, her intimate story with me. And I got to share as well. So the first question was, describe a time when you felt culturally, personally betrayed, shamed, or abandoned, or loyalty, pride, protection in the school system. So for the first one, Michelle talked about how in her experience, she had a brother who got in a lot of trouble, which was he became highly criminalized at the school. And so it reflected a lot on her, to the point where she started getting into a lot of fights at school. And one of the things that helped her and kept her, what do you call it? Well, one thing that helped her was that she was able to join a mentor group and become a peer mediator. And so she was able to change her behavior by being, put into this group, where she was able to think about what it is, the things that you can do to help resolve issues instead of create more issues. And when she talked about that, it helped me to understand how I was challenged as a teenager when I was in school. So when I was in school, I became a teen parent. And so going to school, I had to change schools and go to an alternative school. And so at the school that I was attending, I had to unenroll in that school. And in that process of unenrolling and talking to my teachers, I had a teacher who called me stupid because she found out I was pregnant. And so she told me, that I was stupid because, I had got myself in this situation. Well, then I went to the alternative school for pregnant and parenting teens. And this school was just a lifesaver for me. It helped me to be more, it helped me to feel more safe. And they taught me skills, and it really was a caring environment for me. And so, and that was very liberating for me, even as an individual today. We both talked about how both of those programs for us are no longer in existence. I felt like the program saved my life. Michelle, the way she talked, it seemed like it really helped her out a lot as an individual. And so we were able to overcome some of our challenges just by being in that type of environment, you know. And in the second instance, talking about the decisions that we make that have meaning, you know, the hard, make the hard stuff have meaning, you know, feel there is a setting that you can, you know, Michelle talked about that. Now that she thinks about the experiences she has, she can go into settings and feel, you know, and have a sense, you know, a feeling of what is going on, you know, around her, with individuals around her, and have a better understanding. Instead of questioning or judging, she has a better understanding of those individuals that are having challenges. And I mirrored her perspective as well. I think that one of the great things that we talked about too was that how being treated, you know, as Black and brown people, and how you're treated differently in the school. How she was talking about, because of her background, she got more assistance, she got more help, and she felt like that, you know, she can see how that doesn't happen for those that are Black and brown. And then we talked about how she even brought up this perspective, because I talked about my brother, she talked about her brother, and how, you know, the school system affected them as males, and how they got more in trouble and was more stigmatized in the school system, that caused them to go on a very destructive path as adults. And so we did talk about how young men that act out are pushed aside. You know, they're really forgotten about in the school system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's all I had. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you, Michelle, for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing, both of you. Ori, I know we have like 1 minute. I don't know if we're extending that or not, but you want to hear for maybe one more? We'll hear for one more. You know, what's coming up for you? Thoughts, feelings, emotions.
I can share. I don't remember the number of our group, but we shared our experiences, and then what was coming up for me was particularly being, you know, shamed in high school and elementary school as well. But so being Bosnian, war starting, being from a mixed, you know, marriage, and had to lie about my ethnicity, my parents, to survive. And then once we were refugees in Germany, in Munich specifically, and we were attending a German high school, like a Bosnian classroom was attending a German high school, and some of the German professors, especially one who was teaching the German language, was constantly belittling our culture, yelling at us for being, you know, loud, for being, you know, different, for not speaking German properly, and just our culture in general, and completely disregarded that we were a group of kids who were traumatized and with no mental health, you know, services provided. So thank you for sharing this. I find this really, really powerful, and I wish that all educators can be educated on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of you for sharing and for going through the exercise. It was a short amount of time, and you could probably imagine that taking small snippets of these types of conversations about multiple aspects of our lives beyond education, but you know, even including our various intersecting identities, you know, our class experiences, our gendered experiences, our experiences, you know, with all types of markers of social identity and politics will allow us to develop, you know, and make meaning of our lives. And through that and connecting with others can help us build relationships and containers of support that isolation and the stigma around sharing our stories or our mental health state can, create. But hopefully what you got out of today's session is the power of agency, and that we can, too oftentimes we fall, I'm not sure if the word is victim, but like even when we internalize the ideologies of mass media, right? Even if it's celebrating, kicking it at the club, engaging in some social vices here as a way to, maladaptively cope with our stress. Sometimes it seems celebratory, but it actually acts against our own interests. So that choice is also agency. But hopefully part of what we get out of today is that we can change the narrative that we too oftentimes internalize, that is incoherent and dominant, to rewrite stories in our own image, in our own voice, and in our own interest, that allow us to connect with others, and to use the wisdom we gain after reflecting on the experiences we've had critically, to inform where we want to go, who we want to build with, and what the pathway towards that would look like. And that for you, like for me, would be from going from coping to hoping, and learning to thrive through our own social stress or trauma.
Cam, thank you so much for all that you just offered. I think my head is definitely bumbling with feeling, my heart as well, with feelings, with wonders, with maybe walking away with so many questions is a really good thing. As you mentioned, I feel a deeper sense of agency for sure. I'm reminded of my agency, and also the immense wisdom and agency of young people. And you ask us where we're going and how we're going to get there. And you showed us some beautiful examples of getting there with young people. So thank you so much. I invite you to find the chat box in the next few minutes as I'm sharing some information. What are you walking away with? What words are you walking away with? What ideas? It's a beautiful reminder that there's no middle ground. I'm walking away with as well. And so we thank you deeply for your participation, for rolling with what we've tried out today, and the dyad rather than a breakout group. We have our final session next week, and I'm really excited about next week's session, as it will be all of our faculty together in conversation with you in smaller groups and mini lessons. And so please return for next week's session, where everyone who presented in the weeks past will be joining with something to offer and to continue to build further on. So that's next week, March 22nd. This slide doesn't apply. We have a evaluation, and so all of these offerings are free. We do really want your feedback. What worked? What do you want more of? Or what could we have done differently? We ask you a few questions to help us continue to build out our programming. So please use the QR code, take just a few minutes to fill out the brief survey. And everything, we're going to try to gather the resources that Cam offered in this presentation, and any resource he dropped into the chat, as well as a recording of today's session, and that will be sent out in an email and uploaded onto our website as well. And we invite you to continue to connect with other MHTTC centers, with centers in your region. This is a national project. Stay involved with us. Thank you so much for your energy, your heart, your presence.